You're telling me, the judge said, leaning forward, that this man paid you and you still put a lien on his house? The lawyer froze. I didn't blink. That was the moment I knew. These bastards weren't just sloppy, they were playing dirty. When I first bought that place in Windy Point, all I wanted was quiet. Nothing fancy, just a clean, small townhome with enough space for me and a spare room for my daughter when she visited. I was still picking up the pieces after the divorce. Sold the old house, split the savings, moved out of the city. That townhouse was supposed to be my clean slate. You know, my version of peace. I still remember standing in the driveway that first weekend, watching the sunset behind those perfectly lined palm trees. It felt good, like I'd finally caught my breath after years of holding it. The neighborhood was tidy, quiet, had this kind of artificial calm like a dentist's office, but it suited me just fine. I didn't care if the HOA sent emails about Christmas lights or trash bins. I wasn't looking to make waves, I was just trying to live low and stay out of trouble. Work was remote by then, financial analyst for a few private clients, mostly spreadsheets and Zoom calls and pajama bottoms, nothing exciting, but it paid the bills, and it gave me the flexibility to have Sophie with me every other weekend. She'd come over with her earbuds in and drop her backpack by the door like she owned the place. We'd eat microwave mac and cheese and binge crime shows on Netflix. I lived for those weekends. I was in HOA fees? Sure, 70-something bucks a month automatically deducted. I signed the forms, saved the PDFs, added them to the Do Not Touch folder on my desktop. It all felt like routine maintenance, like car insurance or flossing. Something you do and forget. I didn't even know who was on the board. Honestly, I liked it that way. The only time I ever really noticed the HOA was one random Tuesday, maybe 6 months in. I got an email about a form that needed to be updated for the online payment system. Nothing urgent, no big red warnings, just one of those boring, corporate-sounding messages signed Windy Point Board. I clicked through, checked a box, saved my preferences. Done. Figured that was it. A week later, I got a paper letter in the mail, like actual envelope and everything. Inside was a formal-looking notice saying I hadn't paid the latest HOA fee and now owed a late charge. I was confused, not alarmed. Thought maybe I clicked something wrong or it was just a system hiccup. So I logged into the portal, saw the balance, same 70-something bucks plus a small penalty, and paid it right there. Case closed, right? Except it wasn't, because not long after that, I got another letter. This time, not from the HOA, from a law office. Page and Associates, bold black font, real aggressive tone. It said I now owed over $500. Same 70-something base fee, but now with additional legal fees and administrative charges. They even included this line about potential lien actions if the balance wasn't resolved immediately, and that was the first time I saw his name, Robert Page. Attorney representing Windy Point HOA. I remember holding that letter in my hands and laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. $500 for what? I had already paid. And even if I hadn't, how the hell does a $70 bill balloon into $500 in under a month? I sent an email. No reply. Then I called the HOA office. Some woman answered, cheerful voice, no answers. Told me she'd pass along the message. Nothing. So I called my brother, Greg. He's an attorney up in New York. Not licensed in Florida, but he knows enough to keep me from stepping on legal landmines. I read the letter to him over speakerphone, and there was this pause, like he didn't believe what he just heard. That's not right, he said. You already paid, yeah? Yep, got the records. Then don't send them a dime. But document everything. So I started the folder, printed the emails, saved the letters, made copies of my bank statements. That was the first week I felt something shift, like I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was a target, and I had no clue why. I wasn't behind on anything. I wasn't breaking any rules. Hell, I hardly even saw my neighbors. I trimmed my hedges, paid my dues, minded my business. But somehow, someway, I'd landed in their crosshairs. And deep down, even then, I had this creeping thought in the back of my head, this isn't going to end with just one letter. A few weeks after that letter from Page and Associates, I came home and found a little slip of paper stuck in my doorframe. Looked like something between a parking ticket and a passive-aggressive post-it. Windy Point HOA letterhead. Second notice, delinquent balance. Further non-payment may result in legal action. Second notice, I'd paid already, twice actually, once for the original fee and again when they tacked on a mystery late charge. I'd kept every receipt, every confirmation email. I had the whole digital paper trail saved and printed in triplicate like Greg told me. I remember standing there on the porch, reading that paper in the fading light, and feeling this weird, sharp pulse behind my left eye. I walked inside, dropped my keys, sat down at the kitchen counter, and reread the damn thing. The language wasn't threatening exactly, but it wasn't neutral either. It had that smug corporate confidence, the kind that says, "We know something you don't." So I called the HOA. Again, same cheerful woman answered, same line. Let me forward that to our compliance team. I asked her if she could confirm my payment history, and she said she wasn't authorized to discuss account specifics. When I asked who was authorized, she went silent for a second, and then said, "We suggest contacting the attorney listed on your correspondence." You ever feel like you're being shoved into a corner and told to thank them for it? That's exactly what this felt like. I wasn't mad yet. Not really. Just unsettled. Something wasn't adding up, and the more I tried to get clarity, the more they stonewalled me. It didn't feel like a glitch anymore. It felt like a setup. That same night, I pulled up my HOA portal and checked the balance. $0. $0 due. According to their own system, I didn't owe a damn thing. So why the notices? Why the lawyer? Why the threats? Greg said not to panic. They're pushing. They want to see how far you'll bend. Just keep documenting everything. And I did, but I also started sleeping a little lighter. A couple days later, I noticed a new comment thread pop up on the HOA message board, something about habitual late payers affecting community standards. I don't know if it was about me. No names were mentioned, but the timing was a little too perfect, and the tone, condescending as hell. That was the first time I realized this wasn't just going to fade away. That little slip in the door, that wasn't a nudge. That was a warning shot, and it had nothing to do with money. The next letter didn't even pretend to be civil. Big, bold font at the top. Notice of intent to file Lien. Right underneath, in smaller print, was a breakdown of what they said I owed, over $500. Most of it wasn't even dues. It was labeled administrative costs, attorney fees, and the one that really made my jaw clench, projected legal expense. Projected, meaning future, meaning they were charging me now for things they might do later. I must have read it 6 times before I called Greg. He answered on the first ring. "They're bluffing," he said, "but it's a professional bluff. They're trying to bury you in paper, make you feel like it's easier to just pay than fight." Thing is, I already had paid. I'd paid twice, every cent they were due. What they wanted now was something else entirely. Compliance, surrender. They wanted me to accept that they could say whatever they wanted, charge whatever they wanted, and I'd just roll over and write a check. That's when the messages started showing up in my portal inbox, generic but pointed. Friendly reminder, late balances may affect resaleability. Account status, unresolved. No matter how many screenshots I took of my zero balance, their tone never changed. I emailed, I called, I sent certified letters. Nothing. It was like shouting into a black hole. Then came the meeting. They held it in the clubhouse, which looked like a retired yoga studio. I showed up thinking I could talk to someone in person, explain the situation like 2 normal adults. Maybe I was naive. The room was half full, mostly older folks with clipboards and iced coffees. At the head of the table sat Irene Wexler, HOA president. Pencil skirt, pearl earrings, tight smile. She looked at me like I was a pop quiz she hadn't studied for. When I brought up my issue, she interrupted me before I finished the second sentence. "If you have a financial dispute, you'll need to resolve that through our legal representation," she said, without looking up from her notes. I did. "He won't return my calls," I said. "That's between you and Mr. Page." She moved on to the next agenda item like I wasn't even there. I stood there in front of 20 people blinking like an idiot while they discussed the length of seasonal banners allowed on fences. When I got home, I saw the new letter waiting for me in the mailbox, certified this time. Inside, a copy of the lien. It was real. Recorded. Official. They'd actually done it. They'd filed a lien on my property for a debt that didn't even exist. I sat on the porch and stared at nothing for a long time. The street was quiet. Sprinklers ticked off in the distance, and I remember thinking, not that I'd fight, not yet, but just this sinking electric dread. This was going to get worse, and I was alone in it. Then came the whispering. I'd wave to neighbors, and some would just look away. A couple even crossed the street. At first I thought I was imagining it, but it was too consistent. Someone was talking. Somebody somewhere had started spreading the word that I was one of those guys. The late payer, the problem. There was this post on the community board, friendly reminder, non-payment of dues impacts everyone's property values. It had a smiley face at the end, a damn smiley face. They were coming at me from every direction, through mail, through silence, through fake professionalism, and I was drowning in this quiet, polite version of warfare. But the worst was still ahead. I spent the next few weeks trying to do things the right way. You know, be the reasonable adult, follow the process, avoid making it worse. First thing I did was write a formal dispute letter. Greg helped me word it like a real legal document, cited the payments I'd already made, included copies of every check, every confirmation number, every damn screenshot showing my balance as zero. Sent it certified mail to both the HOA and to Paige's office. Niatahat. Got the return receipts and everything. Then I waited. Nothing. No response, so I followed up with a call to Paige's office. The receptionist put me on hold for 10 minutes, came back and said, "Mr. Paige is currently unavailable. He recommends communicating through written correspondence." I said, "I have been, for weeks." She just repeated the same line, like she was reading it off a laminated card. I called the HOA next. Left a voicemail. Got a call back 2 days later from some assistant who said the board had no additional comment at this time, and that my issue was being handled externally. It was like trying to untie a knot that someone kept yanking tighter every time I touched it. Meanwhile, the lien just sat there, on record, hanging over my house like a dead weight. I couldn't refinance, couldn't sell, and technically, if I missed a single real payment, they could push for foreclosure. Over what? Legal fees they invented out of thin air. So I filed a complaint with the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, filled out all the online forms, uploaded documents, wrote a detailed summary of everything. Greg said it was a long shot, but worth a try. They sent me a reply saying they'd review and respond if necessary. Still haven't heard back. Then I tried a local legal aid nonprofit. Thought maybe they could point me to someone who knew Florida HOA law. The lady on the phone was nice. Said they were overwhelmed with cases but offered to email me a few referrals. She did. I called 3 of them. One never called back. One said he didn't handle HOA disputes under $5,000. The third one told me his retainer started at $3,500. It felt like standing at the bottom of a well, shouting for help, and watching people peek over the edge, shrug, and walk away. Even Greg, as much as he tried to help, was limited. He's licensed in New York, not Florida. He could give advice, help me write letters, but he couldn't walk into court with me. And the more he read, the more pissed off he got. "This is textbook abusive debt collection," he said. "But it's buried inside an HOA structure. They're using a gray zone. They know you can't afford to fight back." I tried reaching out to a few neighbors, casually at first. Just asking if anyone else had dealt with weird charges or sudden legal threats. Most of them got weirdly quiet, like I'd asked them to admit they'd cheated on their taxes. A couple gave vague nods. One even said, "I had some issues early on, but I just paid it to avoid the headache." Avoid the headache. That's what they wanted. Pay and shut up. And then came the real low point. I was out front washing the car, just trying to feel normal for a minute, when Sophie came up behind me holding a letter that had come in the mail, another one from Paige's office. She said, "Dad, are we going to lose the house?" I looked at her and felt like someone had punched straight through my chest. I told her no, of course not. But the truth? I didn't know. I'd done everything I could think of. Called, wrote letters, gathered proof, reached out for help, tried to be patient, and none of it made a damn bit of difference. It was like they weren't just ignoring me, they were erasing me. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I had a real thought in my head. I didn't want to admit even to myself. Maybe I really am screwed. I was this close to giving up. Not because I thought they were right, I knew they weren't, but because it felt like the system was built to grind people like me down until we just folded. I was tired, mentally cooked. Every step I took, they buried me deeper in red tape and silence. Then Greg called me, and I swear to God, he sounded more fired up than I'd heard him in years. "Mike," he said, "I found something, and it changes everything." He had spent the night digging through case law in Florida, looking for anything remotely similar. Buried in a stack of federal filings, he came across a ruling from a case that looked almost identical to mine. Some woman in a different HOA had sued the board and their attorney under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, and the court had sided with her. But But here's the twist. The court ruled that HOA assessments, the dues and late fees and all the made-up charges counted as consumer debt under federal law. And that meant Paige, as the attorney trying to collect it, was legally considered a debt collector. I didn't get it at first. So, I said, he's collecting a debt. Isn't that what lawyers do? No, Greg said. If he's acting as a debt collector, he's subject to strict federal rules. And from what you've told me, he's violated damn near all of them. Threatening legal action on a debt already paid, charging for future legal fees, refusing to validate the debt, intentionally sending misleading letters. All of that? Massive red flags under the FDCPA, but it didn't stop there. Greg had me go dig up the original notice of Lien they filed with the county. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, opening that PDF and reading it like it was the first time. It listed me as delinquent, claimed I owed over $1,000 in unpaid assessments and legal expenses, and included language that made it sound like I was at risk of foreclosure. Except by then, I had already paid them everything. Twice. So that lien, it wasn't just incorrect, it was defamatory, and that meant something even bigger: slander of title. Greg said, Mike, they didn't just mess with your money. They put a false claim on your property in writing in public records. That's a whole new level. Suddenly, I wasn't just some guy yelling at a wall. I had legal ground to stand on. Real footing. The kind of footing that doesn't go away with a brush-off email or a smirk from a board member. Greg didn't stop there. He had a contact, an old law school buddy down in Miami. Guy named Will Delgado, licensed in Florida. Solid reputation, focused on property law and consumer protection. Greg sent him the whole file. 2 days later, Will called me. I read everything, he said. You've got a case? A real one. I'll take it. I just sat there holding the phone to my ear, staring out the window at my front lawn like I didn't know what I was looking at. That was the first time in this whole nightmare I felt it. Not just relief, but leverage. Hope with teeth. The moment that call ended, I opened a new folder on my desktop and labeled it Counterattack, because now I knew the rules. And finally, I had someone on my side who could use them. The first meeting I had with Will Delgado wasn't in some slick downtown office or fancy law firm conference room. It was over a Zoom call. He wore a Miami Heat hoodie and spoke like a guy who'd been in a lot of fights and didn't lose many. I liked him instantly. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He said, we're not just suing the HOA, we're suing Paige too. He's operating like a hitman for the board and pretending it's law. That ends now. Will walked me through the whole strategy. First, we'd hit them under the FDCPA, Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, for violating federal rules around how debts are collected. That one was clean cut. They'd sent false and threatening letters, refused to validate the debt when I asked, and kept adding bogus charges. That's strike one. Then we'd go after them under FCCPA, Florida's version of that law, which has even more teeth if we could show malice or repeated misconduct. And based on the paper trail I'd built, we had receipts. Literal receipts. But the big hammer, that was slander of title. See, by recording a lien that wasn't just inaccurate, but objectively false, while knowing I had already paid, Paige had essentially poisoned the public record on my house. If I'd tried to sell or refinance, that fake lien could have derailed everything, and it wasn't a mistake. It was pressure, leverage, blackmail with a letterhead. We had everything we needed: proof of payment, copies of every letter and email, statements from my bank, the recorded lien, even screenshots from the HOA portal showing my balance as zero right before they filed that lien. And then something else happened. Will asked if I knew anyone else in the neighborhood who'd had similar issues. I told him about my neighbor, Tom, a retired Marine who'd mentioned getting nasty grams from the HOA when he forgot to submit a roof inspection form. I hadn't thought much of it back then, but now it felt like another puzzle piece. Will said, "Get him to talk. We need to know if this is a pattern." So I knocked on Tom's door, told him everything. Laid it all out, even the parts where I looked dumb or desperate. He listened without saying much, arms crossed over his chest, that military stillness about him. When I finished, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Yeah, they tried the same thing with me." Shh. Turns out they'd slapped a fee on him for not responding to an email he never got, then tacked on processing charges, then sent Paige after him. He paid to avoid the hassle. Didn't think he had a choice. Now he was pissed. Tom agreed to give a statement, even said he'd testify if it came to that. Not because he liked courtrooms, but because, in his words, this kind of crap needs to stop. Meanwhile, Will was drafting the complaint, and he brought in a paralegal to organize the timeline. We cataloged everything, every date, every letter, every attempt I made to resolve things peacefully. He said the courts like timelines, they like patterns. We had both. I was still working my job during the day, but every free hour I had, I was digging through folders, checking documents, making sure no detail got lost. It felt like building a case brick by brick, and each time I found something solid, some clause they broke, some timestamp that didn't match, I could feel the tide shifting. Greg checked in constantly. He was just as locked in as I was, texting me legal references and pep talks in the same breath. Sophie started noticing the difference, too. One night, I heard her on the phone with her mom saying, "Dad's fighting back now, for real." It took weeks, a lot of long nights and quiet swearing at the printer, but when Will finally sent me the draft of the lawsuit, I read every single page, twice, and I didn't feel scared anymore. I felt dangerous. We weren't begging for fairness. We were coming for justice, with paperwork and precedent, and for the first time, a lawyer who knew how to hit back. The plan was clear. The pieces were in place. Now it was time to pull the trigger. When the lawsuit was finally filed, I expected some kind of explosion. Calls, emails, emergency board meetings, flaming dog poop on my porch. Instead, nothing. It was quiet. Too quiet. Like the kind of silence you get just before a storm rolls in. Will said that was normal. They're regrouping. They're trying to decide whether to double down or cut bait. I didn't have to wait long to find out which route they picked. A week later, I got an email from Robert Page's office. Not a phone call, just a short, clipped email with one PDF attachment titled Response. I opened it and found a motion to dismiss, like this was all some baseless tantrum I'd thrown. Their argument? That the HOA wasn't a debt collector, Page was acting in good faith, and I had misunderstood the legal process. They even had the audacity to say that I was the one abusing the system by filing a frivolous federal action. Will called it before I even read it. They're trying to kick the legs out from under you before this thing gets off the ground. It's a bluff. We'll respond and we'll make it hurt. And he did. We filed a brutal opposition, point-by-point rebuttal, attached every document, every payment, every certified letter they ignored. We even added Tom's written statement as supporting evidence that this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a pattern. The day after we filed our response, I got a knock on my door. It was Irene Wexler. She stood there like she was making a campaign visit, smile a little too wide, voice dipped in fake sweetness. "Michael," she said, "we heard you're suing the association. That's unfortunate." Unfortunate I didn't invite her in. I just stood there, arms crossed, waiting. I wanted to see if we could talk this out, maybe resolve this without dragging it through the courts. She said that like she was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful for her mercy. I told her calmly that she had months to talk, to listen, to fix this, but she and her board chose to escalate instead. Now we'd let the courts sort it out. She blinked once, just once, then gave this tight little nod like she was filing it away for later. "Very well," she said, and turned to leave. The next board meeting was different. For one, I wasn't invisible anymore. People looked, whispered. A few even came up to me quietly like they were approaching a ticking bomb. One guy, I didn't even know his name, patted me on the shoulder and said, "Good luck, man, took guts." Then came the retaliation. Of course it did. A random compliance violation showed up in my portal. Something about the color of my mailbox being slightly off shade from approved guidelines. It was beige, the same beige it had always been. I sent photos, got no reply. Next week, another notice. "Mirigamat's lawn exceeds acceptable height." My lawn was trimmed. I'd mowed it 2 days earlier. Will laughed when I told him. "They're panicking," he said. "Keep everything, every petty notice, every false claim. It's all evidence now." And then, like clockwork, Page filed a counterclaim, said I was defaming them by calling the lien false, that I was damaging the HOA's professional reputation. I almost choked on my coffee when I read that. They were trying to turn the tables, make it look like I was the aggressor. It was so textbook manipulative it almost felt cliché if I hadn't been the one living it. But this time, I didn't spiral. I didn't panic. I'd expected them to swing back. Hell, I wanted them to. Because every jab they threw now was just more ammo in our hands. Will filed a motion to strike the counterclaim. Filed sanctions paperwork, too, arguing it was a retaliatory move meant to intimidate me into silence. And the judge? He didn't dismiss our case. He denied their motion to dismiss. Suddenly it was real. We were going to court, not a negotiation, not mediation, not another letter in the mailbox. A federal case with discovery, depositions, exhibits. The real deal. That night, I poured myself a glass of bourbon, sat on the back porch, and let it settle in. I was still in the fight, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a losing battle. It felt like the tide was turning, and this time, I wasn't the one being cornered. They were. The hearing was open to the public. I didn't even know that until Will told me, which explains why the room looked half full when we walked in. Mostly HOA folks, a couple of curious neighbors, and one guy who looked like he just wandered in for the free air conditioning. Page sat at his table with a younger associate who looked like he wished he were anywhere else. Irene Wexler was there too, sitting stiff in the row behind him, arms crossed, sunglasses on indoors like she was shielding herself from judgment. She wasn't going to be able to hide. Will laid it all out. Calm, clear, surgical. He walked the judge through every letter Page had sent, pointing out the threats, the bogus fees, the refusal to validate the debt even after I asked in writing. He showed that I had paid what I owed, on time, with records to prove it, and then he put the lien on screen and circled it like a teacher grading a paper. This, he said, isn't just a mistake. It's a weapon, filed knowingly with false information to coerce payment of fabricated charges. That's not an accident. That's slander of title. Page objected. Judge overruled. I sat there watching Page squirm, and for the first time since this whole thing began, I wasn't nervous. I was furious. The quiet kind of fury, the kind that comes from being lied to, ignored, gaslit for months, and finally getting to speak out loud in a room where someone actually had to listen. Then Tom took the stand. He wore his old Navy jacket like armor and told his story in that flat, calm tone military guys have when they've seen worse than this. He told the judge about the threatening letters he got from the HOA, about how they added fees out of nowhere and told him he couldn't speak at a board meeting unless he was in compliance, how he paid the fees just to get them off his back, even though they were wrong. He looked over at me when he stepped down, didn't say a word, but I nodded and he nodded back. That was enough. And then something unexpected happened. Jenny, the HOA board secretary, asked to make a statement. I didn't know she was going to be there, let alone speak. She walked to the front, trembling a little, voice low but steady, said she'd been uncomfortable for months with how the board handled certain members' accounts, said she'd been told not to answer emails from me, that the decision to pursue legal action was made in private emails between Irene and Page, not in any official meeting, said she kept copies. It was like a bomb went off in the room. You could feel the shift. The air got thicker. Page looked like he'd just swallowed his tie. Will barely had to say anything after that. He just rested our case, and I swear to you, the judge leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and stared at Page like a disappointed parent about to deliver a lecture no one forgets. He didn't even take the full 2 weeks to issue a ruling. He ordered the lien removed. He ruled in my favor under FDCPA and FCCPA, CDIF. Said Page had indeed acted as a debt collector and had violated both the letter and spirit of the law. Then came the real kicker. He let the slander of title claim proceed to trial. Said the evidence was substantial enough to warrant a full examination. That's when the story hit the neighborhood newsletter. I didn't write it. Someone else did. Homeowner sues HOA, wins. Simple headline. Inside was a short write-up, just the facts. Federal judge rules against HOA, improper lien. Abuse of legal process. One quote stood out, homeowners are reminded to understand their rights under both state and federal law. After that, everything changed. People I hadn't spoken to in months started waving again. Some emailed. One guy slipped a note under my door thanking me for taking the hit so the rest of us didn't have to. At the next HOA meeting, Irene didn't show up. Page was gone. The new acting board president, some retired math teacher named Carl, opened the meeting with a motion to review past compliance procedures for fairness and transparency. I almost laughed. I didn't say anything. I just sat in the back, arms crossed, and watched the machine try to reassemble itself. Too late. The curtain had been pulled back. A cadetin and a beer. Everybody saw how it worked now, and nobody was scared anymore. A while after everything settled down, I was out back watering the little patch of grass I'd fought so hard to keep mine, and it hit me. I wasn't angry anymore, not numb, not smug, just done, like when a storm finally passes and the sky's still gray but quiet. The lien was gone. The judge's ruling stood. They didn't even bother appealing. Will said we could still go after damages for the slander of title claim, and honestly, we might. Not for the money, but because there should be a record, something official, something that says, you don't get to do this and walk away clean, but I don't lie awake at night thinking about it anymore. The noise in my head's gone. The what-ifs, the stress, the second-guessing, it's just quiet again. Sophie came over the other weekend and brought a friend. They sat in the living room blasting some terrible pop remix, laughing like it was the best sound in the world. I leaned against the kitchen counter, listening, and thought, this is what I was fighting for. Not just the house, not just the paperwork. This peace, this normal, this future. Greg called the other night and asked if I'd ever consider writing about it. People need to know what their rights are, he said. You'd be doing them a favor. I told him maybe. Someday. Sometimes I think about Irene Wexler. Wonder what it's like going from queen of the cul-de-sac to hiding from your neighbors. Part of me feels sorry for her. Most of me doesn't. HOAs aren't evil by default. I know that now, but power without accountability? That's dangerous anywhere, whether it's in a courtroom or a clubhouse. I still live here, by the way. Some folks thought I'd move after all that, but why should I? This is my home. I fought for it, bled for it in a way, and every time I pull into that driveway, see the little dent in the mailbox they once said was a visual nuisance, I smile, because I won, not just in court, in life.